Welcome back to Introduction to Political Science, folks. This week we'll be discussing bureaucracies and public policy. And here are our learning outcomes for the week. We'll outline Weber's model of bureaucracy. We'll outline the various models of policy making. We'll identify the different methods for bureaucratic recruitment or staffing the bureaucracy. We'll identify the policy process at each stage. We'll discuss how democracies and authoritarian states differ regarding bureaucracy and public policy. Okay, let's talk about bureaucracies. Now, all organizations have bureaucracies. If you work for a large corporation, it has bureaucracies. It will have a human resources department. It has all the different departments that go into a large organization. But for the sake of this class, we're talking about public bureaucracies. We're talking about government bureaucracies. And there are some differences between those and private bureaucracies, which we'll explore. So what are some ideals? What are some things that we would like to see in public bureaucracies? This is why we turn to Weber and his model of bureaucracy. Make sure that you understand that in the reading. Of course, we don't always see these characteristics, but this is the ideal. This is the goal. With regard to work and the positions within public bureaucracies, we should see a carefully defined divisions of tasks. There should be clear responsibilities. Decisions are made by methodically applying the rules, and so you should see a similar outcome in similar cases in a highly functional bureaucracy. Recruitment to jobs within the bureaucracy is based on competence, it's based on merit, it's based on what you know, not who you know. Career positions within bureaucracies tend to be secure. These are mostly unelected positions, except perhaps at the very highest level of public bureaucracies. And officials can expect to be secure in their jobs, and in many cases, they are much more permanent. They will not come in with a new president or a prime minister. They will be permanent, and so in many cases, they will see many prime ministers or many presidents come and go during their career. And the structure overall is hierarchical. It's top down. It's almost a little bit like a pyramid with the top decision makers at the very top. And as you go down, it becomes wider. And there's a clear chain of command. So people who are on the lower parts of the bureaucracy report to middle level managers. Those people report to higher level leaders, and then ultimately to the chief executive. May that be a prime minister, may that be a president, as we have in the United States. Okay, make sure that you understand these terms. We don't need to go over each one of them. Make sure that you understand the term bureaucracy, which is ruled by officials. In many cases, when we think about rule by officials, we're thinking about unelected officials, people who have jobs within public bureaucracies. The literal definition of this, a bureau, is a French word for a small desk. So this term sort of derives from, lower level officials and their small desks who are actually doing much more of the permanent governing, or at least that's some of the history of that word. We're probably all familiar with the term red tape, the image of bureaucracies that are tied up in endless procedures and rules. And so this is always a critique that there's too much red tape in bureaucracy. There's too many hurdles to go through to do what you need to do. The idea that people who are hired into the bureaucracy are hired based on talent, qualifications, achievement. This is what we refer to as a meritocracy. Again, it's a goal. We never entirely get there. But the United States, for example, when people get hired into many parts of government, they have to take the civil service exam and sort of demonstrate that they have the skills, they have the test scores, that they have the relevant degrees to get the job that they're seeking in government. If you want to be a diplomat or serve in the United States Foreign Service, you take the Foreign Service exam, and likewise, it measures your skill set, and there's a clear application process if you want to be a Foreign Service officer. And both of these processes are designed to create more of a meritocracy. This is the opposite, by the way, of a spoil system, where when somebody wins political office, they give jobs to their supporters. In the United States, there is a limited amount of presidential appointments within the public bureaucracy. Several thousand of the higher level positions in the different cabinet level departments, but the vast majority of the positions within government, over 2 million, are based on at least an attempt at meritocracy, an attempt at hiring people based on merit and qualifications rather than their connection to political leaders or to the government. There are many critiques of public bureaucracies, one of which is that they're inherently monopolistic, that there's not enough competition as you would see in the private sector. So, for example, if you call 911, you get your local fire department, you get your local police department. When it comes to turning on the taps and water coming out, you probably have only one option of water services for your house. And so, again, sometimes the critique is that bureaucracies become sort of monopolistic. They're not as efficient as they could be. One of the ways that modern bureaucracies attempt to get around this is through new public management. So make sure you understand this term, but it's sort of applying free market principles to make public bureaucracies run more efficiently and putting in processes to cut out waste and abuse whenever possible. One mechanism for this is outsourcing public work. An example at the local level is that many places in Minnesota, the city itself will not collect garbage. They'll take competitive bids for a company to provide garbage service to their city, and that for-profit company will be the one that actually handles recycling and garbage and that kind of stuff. So that's the concept of outsourcing, which is related to the idea of new public management and running public bureaucracies a little bit more like you would see in the private sector. Now, private sector bureaucracies are fundamentally different, though, and we have to recognize that. So if you're working at a large corporation like 3M or General Mills or Nike or something like that, the goal of those large corporations is to turn a profit. That is not really the goal of government at any level. They have certain responsibilities, whether they be to provide health care or whether they be to provide basic security and order, or whether they be like Inver Hills, which is a community college and an educational bureaucracy. In that situation, the goal is to educate people at the college level and create career pathways and degree programs that are helpful when it comes to employment or transferring on. It's not the goal of Inver Hills Community College to run a profit. That's not why it was developed. So public bureaucracies are fundamentally different than private bureaucracies in that their ultimate goal is serving citizens, serving taxpayers, serving members of the community, not necessarily bringing in more money than they're spending. An interesting graph from your textbook that looks at the size of different bureaucracies in countries around the world. Not surprising, the Scandinavian countries of Northern Europe, Norway, Denmark, Sweden tend to see the higher level of employees within public bureaucracies. And this is because they have robust health care services and other social welfare programs that you wouldn't see elsewhere. The United States has a slightly smaller bureaucracy than you would see in many European states. We do not have universal health care in the United States relative to others. Many of our colleges and universities are not run in the public sector. So, and this is looking at bureaucracy at all levels. So we do not have a particularly large federal bureaucracy in the United States. Most public work is done at the state and local level. So most people who work in public bureaucracies, they're your police officers, they're your school teachers, they're your firefighters at the state and local level. Spend some time in your reading considering the role of e-government. And, you might even want to use this as a topic of your next analysis paper, where you talk about how government could be more efficient and provide better services through modern communication technology. Let's explore how public bureaucracies are organized in countries. We can use the United States here as an example. So a large government organization would be a department like the Department of Justice, and that is headed up by the Attorney General in the United States, and that's a cabinet level appointment. So the President of the United States appoints that person, and then the Senate confirms them. And then underneath the Justice Department, there would be many divisions within the Justice Department. one of which would be the FBI and other elements of the Department of Justice. We also have governmental departments that are removed from government to create more political independence. So they're not right in the chain of command of whoever the political executive is. And that's often the case when it comes to managing the central bank of a country, which we call the Federal Reserve. Other organizations could be sort of like a publicly funded corporation like our post office. These are designed to be separated somewhat from the regular chain of command that starts with the elected executive. And a regulatory agency is there to impose standards in a specific area. So that could be fuel efficiency, as we have in the United States. How many miles per gallon must a car or a truck meet to be able to be essentially legal to use in the United States? And we have regulatory agencies that manage nuclear energy, or the Environmental Protection Agency would be an example of one that's setting environmental standards and regulating and enforcing those standards. Many people work in public bureaucracies all over the world, although I bet many of them don't consider themselves to be bureaucrats because that term has a negative connotation to it. But if you work for a public bureaucracy, you are by definition a bureaucrat. And these are your school teachers and your firefighters and your police officers that you'd see at the local level. At the national level, it could be an accountant that works for the IRS, or a FBI agent, or a CIA agent, or an enforcement officer with the Environmental Protection Agency, or a scientist that works for the Environmental Protection Agency. These would all be jobs that are in our public bureaucracies. Different countries handle recruitment for these jobs in different ways. Some countries have a unified recruitment mechanism where they just attempt to hire the best folks they can out of law school, out of graduate school, out of their different top universities. And then once hired, they're placed in a certain part of the public bureaucracy. We tend to see this in unitary countries, which has more centralized government. So Japan would be an example of a country that does unified recruitment. Departmental recruitment is how folks are recruited for public bureaucracies in the United States. So, for example, if you want a job as a diplomat, as a foreign service officer, you would apply to the Department of State, and there is a test, and they will look at your educational background and what your language skills or your technical skills are, and based on those things, they'll determine whether or not they want to give you an offer as a foreign service officer. That would be one such example. If you want to apply to the IRS as an accountant, or some of the examples that I gave before, there's specific recruitment mechanisms based on job and based on department. Probably some of you are familiar with the idea of affirmative action. These are policies that are designed to overcome a legacy of discrimination for people who are in the ethnic minorities or women or other groups that are underrepresented. In the United States, it's perfectly lawful for government at all different levels to spend additional energy reaching out to underrepresented groups. However, you cannot reserve jobs for people based on gender or based on their minority status as ruled by the Supreme Court. So you can't say, well, we're reserving 20% of positions for African Americans or people of Hispanic descent. You can say, though, hey, wait a minute, we serve a community that has a large African American population. They are not reflected in our bureaucracy. Therefore, we're going to spend more time recruiting people from that area. And so long as the same requirements are met, then that's perfectly lawful to do so. So that's how affirmative action functions in the United States. Another term you should be familiar with is the idea of an ombudsman or an ombudsperson, which is a public official who's basically a representative of the people to investigate allegations of waste or fraud or maladministration in a particular department or division. It's a breakdown of gender representation in bureaucracies around the world. We do tend to see women represented much more equitably in public bureaucracies relative to elected roles in government, like in the legislature or in executive positions. So if you take a look at many legislatures and democracies around the world, only about 15 to 20% of the seats are held by women, much higher percentage when it comes to public bureaucracies. Authoritarian leaders need bureaucracies. Dictators need bureaucracies. This is a way to create stability. It also, by providing basic services, this is essential for unelected leaders to maintain power. The number one goal of a dictator is to stay in power. In many cases, when they are removed from office, they are removed violently. So, a dictator does not want this to happen. So in many cases, positions within the bureaucracy are given to individuals and groups that have demonstrated loyalty to the authoritarian leader. Financial opportunities are given to friends. This refers to the term of crony capitalism. And some degree of effective management is necessary for authoritarian leaders to maintain their positions. They're not going to be able to do so if basic security and order and basic functions of government are not accomplished. So, in many cases, non-democratic leaders need bureaucracies more than elected leaders because it's the key to their maintaining power. Transition to public policy here. So if bureaucracy is the engine of government, public policy is the output. It's what the machine creates. So policies are the actions taken to address the needs of society. And that could be with regard to healthcare or national defense or a criminal justice system, you name it. This is the actual outcome. So as you're reading this chapter, make sure that you understand some of these key terms with regard to policy analysis and the different way public policy is created. It'd be fantastic if we saw public policy emerge in a completely rational basis, right? Where people looked at the problem, the best way to deal with the problem, engaging in a really methodical cost-benefit analysis and so on. But most public policy in the United States and around the world doesn't happen that way. It happens closer to the incremental model where we see policy evolve over time. An example would be the creation of Social Security during the Great Depression. You had senior citizens in many cases during that time, highly impoverished during their final years, in many cases hungry, in many cases begging. So the idea was to create a pension system to end poverty with regard to senior citizens. And Social Security initially starts out pretty small. It's about just providing some, very basic income protection for people who are retired, people who can no longer work. And over time, the benefits regarding Social Security have expanded. So that'd be an example of an incremental model. It's become more generous. It's become a more robust pension system. That's an incremental example. Another example, perhaps maybe the most, and it's got sort of the most bleak terminology here, which is the garbage can model, which is that, policy is sort of thrown together. It's disorganized. It's a process of trial and error. And so as much as we would like to describe the policy process as being more rational, it's usually and often much more incremental. And then in some cases, it's sort of like throwing whatever against the wall and seeing what sticks, or the so-called garbage can model. Public policy and the output of government has changed a great deal over time. Going back to the 1800s, the role of public bureaucracies is pretty limited, So you got the idea of sort of a night watchman, basic security and order provided to a city or a community, but nothing like the welfare state that we saw emerge after the Great Depression and the Second World War, where people start looking to government for healthcare, for education, for unemployment relief. And then, over time, as those expanded, we saw pushback in the late 20th century away from some social welfare policies, particularly in Western Europe and the United States, in the United Kingdom and the United States in particular, and moving more to a regulatory state, creating certain rules, certain processes, and away from a large role from government in providing services like healthcare or transportation and so on. Now that may be reversing now. We've seen more and more people over the last 20 years who lack health insurance. There was an attempt under the Obama administration to expand access to health care, but staying within our in many cases, for-profit, private sector form of health care. We're seeing some pushback now, and people who are looking at these countries, particularly in Northern Europe and First World Asia, that are providing getting really good healthcare outcomes at a much lower cost for their countries through more public sector programs. Of course, there are those that still disagree with having too large of a role for government in providing services like healthcare and education and so on. So the debate continues, although we do seem to see a reemergence recently of a demand for greater services when it comes to social welfare programs. This table from your reading looks over the 3 models of policy making that's explored in your textbook. Make sure you understand them clearly. You can expect some questions on them in your next quiz. Here's the policy making process. It begins with initiation, when a problem is placed on the public agenda. Hey, this is something we need to deal with. Sometimes this issue is placed there due to media attention, or there are policy entrepreneurs that work hard to get a particular issue or problem on the nation's agenda, something that we start talking about. In many cases, the beginning of the policy process is because of a crisis. Let's use the COVID-19 crisis. That crisis was thrust upon us. Okay, so now we have this global pandemic. What do we do about it? We need to do something about it. We move into the formulation phase. How do we formulate a response to this national and international pandemic? This is where you come up with clear plans. This is hopefully you engage in a rational process, but in many cases it could be some version of incremental or a garbage can approach. I think most people would call it a garbage can approach in terms of how the United States handled its response to COVID-19. But out of this comes hopefully a plan, and then you get to implementation. How are you going to deal with this plan? How are you going to get people the therapeutics and the care that they need? How are you going to accelerate the development of a vaccine? And this is the critical phase here. You could have the best plan in the world, but if the rollout's bad, it's not going to work. Ultimately, as you carry out the plan, you need to evaluate it. You need to have clear metrics. Hey, we set out to get everybody vaccinated. Were we able to do that? And at the end of the day, you need to review, what worked, what didn't, how can we improve the structure for the next time we face a global pandemic or a national health crisis of this level. So we need to spend some time reviewing, spend some time studying what went right and what didn't go so well. Again, more fun terminology. Do understand the concept of policy entrepreneurs. These are people who are actively proposing new ideas or policies and trying to raise an issue. We have these all over. They could be gun rights activists, gun control activists, people who want to see public health care expanded, people who don't want to see public health care. And they're constantly working to elevate not only their issue, but the way they think that we should deal with that particular issue. And in many cases, a crisis will come up, and that crisis creates an opportunity for a policy entrepreneur. So, for example, right now, because we're having a national healthcare crisis, many people who want to see a larger role for government when it comes to dealing with healthcare, they say, hey, this is an opportunity. This is an opportunity to expand coverage. This is an opportunity to demonstrate how important it is that we have universal health care. So during times of crisis, in many cases, policy entrepreneurs will seek to say, hey, we're going to use this period of time to further our policy goals. Now, policy in some cases can be implemented top down from the highest levels of government to the local level. You'd see that happen much more in unitary systems like Japan or in the United Kingdom and other countries where power is more centralized in their capital. In the United States, we have much more of we do have a federal system. A lot of policy emerges from the city level, could be the county level. So we see more bottom-up implementation than we might see in a more of a unitary system. In either way, you can develop a policy that is effectively implemented at the street level, and that's important to recognize that, you know, how you carry out a policy might differ. You know, if you're in Iowa versus New York, the implementation strategy might be quite a bit different. Policy outputs, these are the actions of government, which is pretty easy to define. So for example, a policy output could be to get everybody vaccinated in the United States. You know, you can determine whether or not that happened. A certain, you know, hundreds of millions of vaccines were given. Policy outcomes is a little bit different. What's the achievement? Did the vaccines actually work? Sometimes this can be difficult to measure. How effective were these policy outputs? And that's why it's so important that you review any public policy carefully. You know, there are clear measures. We were going to vaccinate this many people, and it was going to lead to herd immunity, and it was going to lead to the decline of the COVID-19 virus. So it's very important on the review component of the policy cycle that this is carefully analyzed and determine whether or not that government had met its objectives. And yes, there is public policy in authoritarian states, but, you know, related to what I said earlier, the number one goal for authoritarian leaders, for dictators, is to stay in power. So it is not necessarily the goal of public policy is not necessarily about good governance. It is about defending the existing power structure. So make sure that as you're going through the reading on public policy that you understand the differences in the role of public policy between democratic states and authoritarian states. Okay, let's sum up, beginning with bureaucracies. Weber's traditional model of bureaucracy is a starting point. It's an ideal when it comes to understanding a functional bureaucracy. New public management, outsourcing, has changed the way bureaucracies function, and in many cases running more like the private sector. E-government makes it easier to access government, but also raises concerns about surveillance and privacy and data protection and other concerns. In democracy, the public sector, it's a complex network of departments, divisions, and regulatory agencies. And then in a country like the United States, we have it at different levels of government. So we have it at the federal level, and we have it at the state level, and in many cases we have it at the city and the county level as well. Two factors in determining the quality of public employees are how they're recruited and how you hold them accountable. And we discussed that somewhat already. And it's also important to recognize that dictators need bureaucracies to survive, maybe even more so than in democratic states. And to sum up our public policy reading, policymaking can be imagined as a rational process with precise goals, but that's rarely the way it actually occurs. So spend some time understanding both the incremental and garbage can models to provide a dose of realism. Breaking down the policy process into clear stages from initiation to review helps in analyzing and comparing public policy. Public policy and related processes serve much different purposes in authoritarian states, authoritarian systems, where the number one goal is to hang on to leadership and to defend the authoritarian leader. And here are your guiding questions for the week. Make sure that you have one substantial original post and at least two responses to the on-topic posts of your classmates. We're in the final half of the course. Please reach out to me if you have any questions or concerns, particularly if you are missing a paper, a substantial amount of participation, or quizzes. I really want to make sure that everybody is on a path to successfully complete the course. Have a great week, and let me know if you have any questions or concerns.